Victor Von Doom never lied. In 50 years of recorded history, across every timeline and dimension the Marvel Universe has chosen to preserve, there is not a single confirmed instance of Victor Von Doom telling a deliberate untruth. He has threatened civilizations. He has maneuvered gods like pieces on a board only he could see clearly. He has done things that when a losing side does them, history calls atrocities, and when a winning side does them, history calls strategy. But he has not lied. Not once. Not even when lying would have been easier, or safer, or more merciful. That fact should stop you. That fact, held alongside the name the world has given him, should produce a kind of friction that does not resolve easily. Sit with that friction. Let it stay with you as the story begins. Let your body find its weight now. Feel the surface beneath you, bearing that weight without effort, without complaint, simply holding you the way surfaces do when you finally allow yourself to be held. Breathe in slowly, through the nose if that is comfortable, and let the breath go without pushing it out. Your shoulders can drop, your jaw can loosen. The mind does not need to work tonight. The story will do the work. All you are asked to do is remain here in the quiet and listen as the picture assembles itself in the dark. Come to Latveria, not the Latveria that exists in the present tense of the Marvel Universe, with its iron towers and its castle rising from the mountain ridge, like something the mountain decided to become after centuries of considering its options. Come to Latveria before any of that. Come to the village at the base of the mountain, where the houses were built from the same stone as the mountain, and looked as though they had not so much been constructed as gradually separated from it. Come to January. Come to the specific quality of cold that Latverian January carries, which is not the aggressive cold of a storm, but the settled cold of a place that has decided this is simply what it is, and has been for as long as anyone can remember, and will be for longer than anyone currently alive will be around to experience. Into this cold, into this permanent and patient winter, Victor Von Doom was born. His mother was a woman named Cynthia, and she was a sorceress in the same way that certain people are surgeons or architects, meaning that it was not a peripheral quality, but a central and defining one, the thing around which the rest of her life organized itself. She had grown up within a Roma tradition that understood the world as layered, as possessed of depths beneath the visible surface that could be learned, and with sufficient skill and sufficient respect, navigated. She could read the weather and the behavior of birds 2 days before the weather arrived. She could locate water in limestone that showed no surface moisture. She could speak in the register that the older forces of the world used among themselves, the forces that predate human civilization, and that tend to outlast the empires built on top of them. She used these capabilities in the service of the community around her, healing, advising, interceding on behalf of those who could not intercede for themselves, which, in Latveria in those years, described almost everyone she knew. The Baron who governed the region was the kind of ruler that systems produce when they insulate power from consequence for long enough. He taxed without ceiling and extracted without limit. He treated the population under his authority as a resource to be depleted at a rate calibrated to just below the rate that would produce open revolt, and he performed this calibration with the casual competence of someone who had been doing it for so long that it had stopped feeling like cruelty and started feeling like management. Cynthia was a problem for him, not because she represented a military threat or an organized opposition, but because she was loved. and love in a population that has been taught to feel nothing but obligation is a form of independence that administrators of his type find instinctively threatening. He tolerated her. She, for her part, did what she could within the space that tolerance provided, and she watched what she could not change with the specific grief of someone who understands the architecture of an injustice without yet having found the lever that would bring it down. The records of what happened next are incomplete in the way that records of desperate moments tend to be. The emotional reality precedes the documentation, and by the time anyone is writing it down, the most important details have already become legend, which means they have become distorted in the direction of whatever truth the people telling the story most needed the story to contain. What is consistent across the versions is the essential shape of the event. Cynthia von Doom, having watched her community suffer, passed the point at which patience felt like virtue rather than complicity, reached beyond the ordinary register of her tradition. She called on a power that existed at a level of the world her teachers had warned her about, a power that was older and less conditional than the forces she had spent her life learning to work with. The entity that answered to that call was Mephisto. He was and is the Marvel Universe's most precise reader of what desperate people are willing to trade for what they cannot otherwise obtain. He offered her what she wanted. She said yes. The terms, as the terms of agreements with Mephisto always do, extracted something that Cynthia had not fully accounted for when she accepted them. Her soul was the price. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment of collection, but with the particular patience of a creditor who knows the debt is secure and can therefore afford to wait. She gained what she sought. Her community received some measure of relief from the specific pressure that had driven her to the agreement. And she carried the knowledge of what she had traded for it with the quiet devastation of someone who has done the calculation correctly and arrived at an answer they cannot afford to stop looking at. Victor was young when his mother was taken. Young enough that the full philosophical weight of what had happened would take years to become something he could hold and examine with the tools of a mind that was already even then extraordinary in its construction. But grief does not wait for the mind to develop adequate tools. It arrives on its own schedule and installs itself in the body with a thoroughness that bypasses the intellect entirely. He felt her absence the way he felt the Latverian cold, not as an event, but as a condition, as something the air itself had restructured around. The warmth that had organized his world was gone. What remained was the shape of where it had been, and the cold and the understanding gathering slowly in him like weather, that the world had taken something from him and had not asked whether he could afford the loss. His father Werner was a physician, a quiet and careful man who had built his reputation on the specific combination of genuine skill and genuine concern that earns trust in the communities where it is practiced. He was not ambitious in the conventional sense. He was not building toward anything beyond the continued ability to do the work he had chosen, which was the work of keeping people alive when their bodies were working against them. He was good at it. He was respected for it. And he was in the particular way that competent and decent people are useful to those who need someone competent and decent to use, subject to the demands of the Baron's court whenever those demands arose. The summons came in the deep of winter. The Baroness was ill. The illness was serious, and the court physician apparently insufficient to the case. Werner was required. He went because in Latveria in those years, required and voluntary described the same action when the requirement came from the Baron. He arrived at the castle and was installed in the anteroom designated for waiting physicians, which was a room that had not been designed with the comfort of its occupants in mind, and that the winter had entered without encountering meaningful resistance. Victor came after him, drawn by the pull that children feel toward a parent in circumstances that the child's body understands as threatening before the child's mind can articulate why. He found his father in the cold and sat with him in it, and Werner, without deliberation or ceremony, took off his coat and wrapped it around his son. He did this with the efficient tenderness of a man performing a clinical procedure, checking the coverage, adjusting the collar, making sure the warmth was distributed adequately. Then he sat back down in his physician's clothes in the cold anteroom and attended to his waiting and did not mention what the cold was doing to him. Victor wore the coat home. He wore it through the remaining weeks of that winter, after his father's body gave out what it had been silently conceding all along. Werner von Doom died of the exposure he had accepted without complaint, which is a kind of death that does not make it into the dramatic registers of history, but that produces, in the people left behind by it, a particular quality of sorrow. It is the sorrow of watching someone sacrifice themselves, not heroically, not in a defining moment, but quietly, incrementally, in the small and unwitnessed ways that love expresses itself, when love does not have access to any larger or more visible gesture. Victor sat with his father at the end, the way he had sat with him in the anteroom. In proximity, in the cold, understanding what was happening and not having the language to do anything with the understanding except carry it. He taught himself then. This is the fact about Victor von Doom's education that the dramatic chapters that follow tend to obscure. Before the scholarship, before the university, before the laboratories and the experiments, and the argument that would mark his face and his history simultaneously, there was a boy in the Latverian mountains constructing his own education from whatever materials he could find. Mathematics from texts that circulated through channels informal enough to reach even that far. The neighboring languages, and then the languages beyond those, the principles of the physical world as those principles had been articulated by the minds that had bothered to articulate them. And his mother's knowledge, the tradition she had practiced and that she had begun to pass to him before she was taken. He pursued these two traditions with equal seriousness, refusing the assumption that they were in opposition, that the world of measurable forces and the world of older, less measurable ones were separate territories requiring separate allegiances. He wanted all of it. He was going to need all of it. Sit with that for a moment. Let the story pause here, in the Latverian cold, with a boy in his dead father's coat, surrounded by everything he is teaching himself to become. This is the origin of one of the most powerful minds the Marvel Universe has ever produced, and it begins without a laboratory explosion, without cosmic radiation, without the intervention of any force beyond the combination of grief and will, and the specific stubbornness that emerges when someone has decided, before they have the vocabulary to express it, that the world as it currently exists is not acceptable. The grief is real, the cold is real, the boy is real, and he is building something, and the world does not yet know what it is, which is perhaps the only period in Victor von Doom's history when the world had the luxury of not knowing. The grief did not leave. Grief of that particular kind does not leave, not really, not in the way that wounds heal, and leave only the faint architecture of the scar. What happened instead was that Victor learned to build around it, the way a city learns to build around a river it cannot fill in, incorporating the waterway into the infrastructure rather than pretending it is not there. The grief became the reason the work mattered. The two absences, his mother and his father, the warmth and the coat, became the engine of a discipline that expressed itself in the kind of focused, daily, total commitment to learning that looks, from the outside, like ambition, but that feels, from the inside, like the only available response to a world that has demonstrated it will take from you without warning and without limit unless you become, by whatever means necessary, someone it cannot afford to take from any more. The scholarship came because the work was impossible to ignore. The demonstration of capability was so complete, so thorough, so far beyond what the educational infrastructure of Latveria was equipped to assess or accommodate, that the information travelled, as information about exceptional things tends to travel, to people in positions to act on it. A place was offered at State University in New York. Victor looked at the door this opened and walked through it the way someone walks through a door they have decided will not close behind them. The mountains of Latveria watched him go in the particular silence of places that are accustomed to watching people leave, and have long since made their peace with the departure. What waited on the other side of the journey was a world that moved faster, thought louder, and had not yet learned to account for what was coming toward it. Let the breath come in slowly now. Feel the air move into the body and let it release at its own pace, without hurrying it. You are still here. The night is still quiet around you. The story is moving, but it is moving at the pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has decided there is no reason to rush. Follow it at that pace. Let everything else go still. New York, in the years of Victor von Doom's arrival, was a city that had developed a very specific kind of immunity to being impressed. It had seen so much exceptional ability walk through its institutions, had processed so many brilliant and hungry and determined people through its corridors and classrooms and laboratories, that it had arrived at a kind of ambient skepticism about any new claim to extraordinary capability. This was, in most cases, a healthy and reasonable adaptation. In Victor von Doom's case, it was simply wrong, and the wrongness became apparent quickly enough that the institution did not have time to prepare its defences before they were already irrelevant. He arrived at State University, carrying the dual tradition he had spent years building in Latveria, the mathematical and scientific framework on one side and the sorcerous education on the other. And he arrived with the calm of someone who has been, for long enough, that it has become unremarkable, the smartest person in the room. He was accustomed to understanding things faster than the people around him. He was accustomed to finding the structure inside a problem before the people explaining the problem had finished explaining it. He was not accustomed to encountering anyone who operated in the same register at the same depth, with the same combination of breadth and precision that he brought to any domain he chose to enter. He was not accustomed to read Richards. Richards was there when Victor arrived, already established as a presence in the university's scientific community, already building the reputation that would eventually make him one of the most recognized scientific minds on the planet. He was warm where Victor was controlled. He was collaborative where Victor was sovereign. He approached problems with the openness of someone for whom the act of discovery was pleasurable in itself, not merely instrumental to something else. These qualities are often characterized, in the telling of the Doom Richards story, as the reasons the two men could not get along. This characterization misses something important. The reason the relationship between Victor and Reed became the defining rivalry of both their lives was not because they were different. It was because they were so nearly the same, and because that nearness was something neither of them had encountered before, and because the ways in which they differed were precisely the ways that produced, when pressed against each other, the kind of friction that illuminates. Victor studied simultaneously across the science and engineering departments and maintained, in parallel and largely without institutional support, his continued practice in the sorcerous tradition. The faculty found this combination difficult to categorize, and finding it difficult to categorize, tended to dismiss one element or the other depending on their own disciplinary commitments. Victor found the difficulty of categorization irrelevant. He was not studying in order to fit into an existing framework. He was assembling the components of something that did not yet have a name, a synthesis of the material and the mystical that treated them not as opposing descriptions of reality, but as complementary languages for the same underlying structure, each capable of expressing things the other could not. He worked on this synthesis with the total absorption of someone who has found the question that was always going to be his question, and the laboratory at night, when the other students had gone, was the space where that work lived. The experiment that changed everything has been told so many times, and in so many versions, that the telling has acquired the quality of mythology, which is to say, it has become more true in its shape than in its details. The essential facts are these. Victor was developing a machine intended to establish contact with his mother's soul, in the dimension where Mephisto held it. The mathematics underlying the device was extraordinarily complex, operating at the intersection of theoretical physics and dimensional mechanics in ways that the university's existing framework had no adequate models for. Victor had constructed those models himself. He believed they were correct. He had tested what he could test, verified what verification was available for, and was preparing for a trial that he understood to be dangerous and accepted that danger as the cost of what he needed to accomplish. Reed Richards reviewed the equations. He was not asked to review them. He reviewed them because he was the kind of mind that cannot look at a complex and unresolved mathematical structure without engaging with it, the way certain people cannot hear a piece of music without following its internal logic wherever it leads. He found what he believed was an error, a small one, a single variable in a subsidiary calculation that he thought had been handled incorrectly. He told Victor. He was not trying to embarrass Victor. He was not trying to establish superiority or undermine a competitor. He was doing what his temperament equipped him to do, which was to share a discovery with someone who might find it useful. Victor did not find it useful. This is the pivot on which so much of what follows turns, and it deserves more than the dismissive treatment it usually receives in accounts that are in a hurry to get to the explosion. Victor did not ignore Richards because he was stupid, or irrational, or simply proud in the blind way that mediocre people are proud when they cannot hear criticism, because they cannot distinguish it from attack. Victor did not recheck the calculation, because he had looked at his own work long enough and deeply enough that he had arrived at a certainty about it that felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from knowing. He was certain. He ran the trial. The machine exploded. The scar on his face was, by most accounts, minor. This is the detail that rewrites everything that comes after it, and it is the detail that most tellings either minimize or omit entirely. The damage was real, but it was not the damage of someone whose face had been destroyed. It was the damage of someone who had been close to an explosion and had been marked by it, the kind of scar that heals to something the world might look at without flinching, and that the person wearing it might, over time, come to regard as simply part of their face. Victor did not regard it that way. Victor regarded it as a failure, as an imperfection, as evidence of a moment when his certainty had proved insufficient to the test he had designed for it. And the rage this produced in him was directed not at himself, but at the man who had told him something was wrong, and whom he had refused to hear. He was expelled from the university. The explosion, the damage, the questions about his research methodology, and his willingness to conduct trials of this nature in institutional facilities all combined to make his continued enrollment untenable from the university's administrative perspective, and Victor did not argue. He did not argue because arguing would have required conceding that the institution had standing to evaluate his choices. And he did not accept that it did. He left. He carried with him the scar, the failure, the fury at Richards, and something underneath all of those that none of the documentation captures cleanly. The knowledge that his mother's soul was still wherever it was, unreached, and that the distance between him and her was exactly as large as it had been before he built the machine, and that the machine was now gone. What he also carried, though it would be years before the weight of this particular piece of luggage became fully apparent even to him, was the possibility that Richards had been wrong. Not in the charitable or exculpatory sense, not as a way of redistributing blame, but as a genuine structural possibility in the mathematical argument. The variable that Richards identified as an error was not, when examined by minds that came after them and had access to more complete models, definitively incorrect. The explosion may have been caused not by the error Richards named, but by the interaction between Victor's awareness of Richards naming it and the specific adjustments Victor made, or did not make, in the final moments before the trial. The machine may have worked. It may have failed not because the mathematics were wrong, but because the moment of doubt, however briefly entertained, however immediately dismissed, was sufficient to introduce into the system a perturbation that the system could not absorb. He may have been right all along. His face may have been scarred not by his own error, but by the weight of someone else's well-intentioned intervention in a calculation that did not need to be intervened in. This is the possibility that sits underneath the entire history that follows, that colours every confrontation with Richards, every declaration of superiority, every act of refusal to concede a point or a victory, or a moment of parity. Victor von Doom may have spent his entire life being punished for being correct, and the person he blames for that punishment is the person who is only trying to help. And the person who is only trying to help has spent his entire life not fully understanding why the help he offered produced the response that it did. The mountains of Latveria were a long way from New York. But they were still there, and the cold was still the same cold, and the coat his father had given him was still in his mind with the weight of things that do not leave simply because you move to a different continent. He left New York with the scar on his face, and the equation still alive in his mind, and the absolute conviction that what he needed to do next, he would need to do outside the reach of institutions that could expel him. He needed to go to a place that would forge what he was designing. He knew exactly where such a place was. The specific quality of their early dynamic deserves more attention than it usually receives, because the story of what happened between them is usually told as a story of collision. Two objects moving in the same space and finding the space insufficient. When the more accurate story is one of recognition, followed by the specific discomfort that recognition produces when it arrives between people who have organized their identities around being singular. Victor recognized in Richards from the earliest days of their proximity a mind that did not immediately resolve into something manageable that remained, however long he examined it, genuinely interesting in the way that only things capable of genuine surprise remain interesting. He did not like this. He valued it with the specific ambivalence of someone who has found the thing they needed and cannot fully welcome it because the finding requires a concession he is not prepared to make. The night of the experiment was a night that had been building for months, not in the dramatic sense of tensions escalating toward a breaking point, but in the subtler sense of a complex thing moving toward its natural test. Victor had been working on the device with the total and exclusive focus that characterized his engagement with any problem he considered genuinely important. And the genuinely important problems for Victor were not the problems that mattered to the university or to the scientific community or to any institutional framework. The genuinely important problems were the ones that mattered to him, and the problem of reaching his mother through the dimensional barrier that Mephisto had constructed around her was the most important problem there was. He had been building toward this night for years. The machine was as ready as it was going to be. He was as ready as he was ever going to be. What he was not ready for was what Richard said. He left New York in the specific emotional state of someone who has experienced a catastrophic failure and who has not yet decided whether the catastrophe was theirs or someone else's. A state that produces a kind of suspended rage that is more dangerous than ordinary anger because it has not yet found its final address. The scar on his face was minor, as has been noted, and the fact of its minourness was almost worse than the fact of the scar itself, because a minor scar is the wrong scale for the size of what he felt had happened. The universe owed him something larger. He was going to make it into something larger. The decision to go to Tibet, to have the monks forge what he was designing, to press the iron to his face and make permanent what the explosion had only begun, was not a decision he arrived at slowly. It arrived all at once, with the specific clarity of someone who has just understood what the rest of their life is going to look like. Feel the breath moving in the body now. Slower than it was, quieter than it was, settling into a rhythm that belongs to the deepest and most restful part of you, rather than the part that is still solving today. You are going somewhere cold again. Not the cold of Latveria, not the cold of a castle anteroom, but a different kind of cold. The cold of altitude, the cold of a mountain that has never been warm and has never needed to be, where the air is thin and clean and tastes of nothing except its own absence of everything else. Go there quietly. The story is waiting. The monastery in the mountains of Tibet had been there long enough that the monks who inhabited it had stopped thinking of themselves as inhabiting a place, and had started thinking of themselves as an extension of it. The stone walls were the same stone as the peaks around them. The cold inside was the same cold as the cold outside, moderated only slightly by the bodies of the men who moved through it in the particular unhurried way of people who have decided that hurry is a misapprehension of how time actually works. These men were craftsmen of an order that most of the world had forgotten, specialists in metals and in the older techniques for working them, in the application of heat and hammer to materials that most modern metallurgy could replicate only in the grosser sense, producing the shape without the substance beneath the shape. Victor found them because he had been looking for them, and he had been looking for them because he had understood, sitting with his plans in the wreckage of everything the university had represented, exactly what he needed built and exactly what kind of skill the building of it would require. He arrived at the monastery with his designs and his specifications and the particular quality of attention that he brought to any collaboration, which was not the attention of someone who was working with the craftsmen, but the attention of someone who was directing them, with the expectation that his direction would be followed precisely, not because he was cruel or dismissive of their skill, but because the object being built was an object whose specifications were not negotiable. He had calculated every dimension. He had accounted for every structural requirement. He had designed the armor with the same synthesis of scientific precision and mystical awareness that he brought to everything he built, encoding into the physical structure of the metal itself a set of properties that went beyond what the metal, treated as merely metal, would have been capable of expressing. The monks worked. Victor watched. The shape of the armor emerged from the forge, the way solutions emerge from sufficiently rigorous thought, as though it had always been there, waiting for the correct process to make it visible. The mask was the last piece. It was designed not merely as protective equipment, not merely as concealment, but as the final answer to a question that Victor had been living inside for the months since the explosion. The question of what to do with a face that had been marked by a moment of failure, that he had decided to refuse to accept as definitively his. The mask would cover it. That much was obvious and was not, in itself, interesting. What was interesting, what was the act that separated what Victor did from what a merely practical person would have done, was the instruction he gave to the monks about the temperature at which the mask was to be applied. He asked them to place it on his face directly from the forge. Still hot, still radiating the heat of the process that had created it, the metal cooling towards the equilibrium it would eventually find, but not there yet, not finished with the fire that had given it its shape. The monks refused initially. This was the instruction of a man asking them to participate in something that would cause him serious and permanent harm, and they were craftsmen of extraordinary skill and discipline, but they were not, by any stretch, equipped to understand why a person in full command of their faculties would make this request. Victor explained, not at length, not with the elaborate philosophical justification that the act perhaps deserved, but with the directness of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is offering the explanation not because they need permission, but because they are extending the courtesy of clarity to people who will carry the memory of this moment for the rest of their lives. He was not punishing himself. This is the interpretation that the story most often receives, and it is the interpretation that understands the least about Victor von Doom. Self-punishment implies a relationship with guilt, with the belief that suffering is a form of payment toward a debt that the suffering can reduce. Victor did not believe in debts of that kind. What he believed in, with a clarity that had been hardening in him since the night his father gave him the coat, was the distinction between being marked by events and choosing your marks. The scar the explosion had left was a mark the world had given him without his consent, on terms he had not agreed to, as a consequence of a moment that he was not yet finished arguing about. The burn the mask would leave was a mark he was choosing, entirely, deliberately, without ambiguity. He was taking the thing the world had done to him and exceeding it on his own terms, going past it into a territory that no external event could reach, because he had already been there. The mask came from the forge. It was placed against his face. The sound it made has been described by those who have attempted to imagine it as the sound of a decision becoming irrevocable, which is the sound that significant decisions tend to make when they are the kind of decisions that cannot be unmade. The pain was immediate and total, and Victor did not make it available for anyone to observe. He stood in the cold air of the monastery with the iron cooling against his skin, and his face becoming something new, and he was, in that moment, making a covenant with himself, of the kind that other people make in the language of prayer. He was saying, I will not be what the world made. I will be what I have decided. And the covenant was sealed in iron, and in cold, and in the absolute privacy of a man who has accepted that no one will ever see him uncertain again, because he will never again allow a surface that shows uncertainty to exist. When the monks helped him secure the rest of the armor, when the gauntlets were in place and the cloak was settled around the iron frame, and the whole of the construction had become a thing standing in the monastery's cold light, what was standing there was not Victor von Doom preparing to become Dr. Doom. What was standing there was Dr. Doom. The name had not yet been spoken by the world. The world had not yet been given the opportunity to use it. But the entity that the name described was complete, in the same way that a mathematical proof is complete when the last line has been written, and the structure holds when every component does what it was designed to do, and the whole is more than the sum of the parts by the specific margin that makes some things extraordinary and other things merely adequate. Pause here. Let the story settle around this image. The figure in iron standing in a Tibetan monastery in the cold, the forge still warm behind him, the monks still and respectful in the specific way of people who have witnessed something they do not entirely understand, but whose importance they can feel in the quality of the silence it has produced. Let yourself sit in that silence for a moment. There is something here about the relationship between suffering and decision, about the specific act of taking the thing that hurt you and incorporating it into what you are building, making it structural rather than incidental, making it the foundation rather than the wound. This is not a lesson that recommends itself for casual application, but it is the thing that Victor von Doom did, and understanding what he did and why he did it changes everything about how the story that follows reads. He looked at the world for the first time through iron eyes, and the world looked back without knowing what it was looking at. The monastery's courtyard was quiet. The peaks around it were the same peaks they had always been. The cold was exactly itself, and inside the armor, inside the iron that was now bonded to the architecture of his face and the architecture of his intentions simultaneously, Victor von Doom was doing what he had always done, which was thinking. He was thinking about Latveria, which was still under the governance of a baron whose tenure had been made possible by the extraction of resources and dignity from people who had not consented to the arrangement. He was thinking about his mother's soul, which was still in Mephisto's realm, unreached and closer to reach now than it had been before, because the armor that held sorcery as structure rather than supplement had given him capabilities that exceeded what the university experiment had been designed to access. He was thinking about a man in New York whose equations he had refused to double-check, and about the scar beneath the iron, and about the way that every element of his history was beginning to resolve into something that felt not like a series of disconnected disasters, but like a preparation. He left the monastery the way he had arrived, without ceremony, without explanation, without any of the conventional social machinery that most people use to mark transitions. He walked down from the altitude into the warmer air of the lower slopes, and then into the world that existed below the mountains. And he moved through it in his armor. And he was looked at, of course, because iron does not go unnoticed in the world of ordinary commerce, but the looking did not produce in him any of the discomfort that attention had once produced. He was past discomfort. He had made himself into something that had already absorbed the worst the world could direct at it. And what remained of him after that absorption was not the diminished thing that most encounters with the world produce, but something harder, something more complete, something that was going to be extremely difficult to take anything from. Latveria was northeast, and it was waiting. Not patiently, exactly, because places do not practice patience in the way people do, but in the settled way of things that have been as they are for long enough that change has become a kind of abstraction, something that happens in theory to places elsewhere. Victor was about to make it specific. He was about to bring change to Latveria with the thoroughness of someone who has been thinking about it since childhood, and who has now, for the first time, all the tools the thinking always required. The mountains he had left were still behind him. The mountains he was going back to were ahead. And in the iron, in the cold, in the synthesis of everything he had built himself into, he was already there. The design itself was the synthesis made visible, the first complete external expression of the thing Victor had been building internally since childhood. Every component of the armor engaged with both traditions simultaneously, the alloys selected for properties that were as much mystical as mechanical, the geometry of the construction encoding dimensional relationships that most engineers would have had no framework for perceiving, and that most sorcerers would have had no language for incorporating into a physical object. The monks worked with materials they understood as craftsmen, and within specifications they did not always fully comprehend, and Victor supervised with the patience of someone who knows exactly what they need, and is willing to stand in the cold for as long as the making of it requires. The forge's light filled the monastery in the evenings with a warmth that the mountain air could not quite reach. And in that warmth, in that slow and careful making, something was being born that would outlast almost everything else his story produced. The first night in the monastery with the armor fully assembled but not yet worn, Victor sat in the cold with the iron on the floor before him and ran through the final calculations with the part of his mind that could not stop running calculations even when the rest of him was doing something else entirely. The mystical properties he had encoded held. The structural integrity matched the specifications. The synthesis worked in theory in exactly the way it needed to work in theory before it could be tested in practice. He was not afraid. Fear, in the conventional sense, had been a resource he ran out of in the Latverian cold long before tonight, and what replaced it was the specific calm of someone who has accepted that the thing they are about to do is going to cost them something significant, and who has decided that the cost is not, in the final accounting, relevant to the decision. Let the breath come quietly now. There is no urgency here. The night is holding everything in the soft way that nights do when you are willing to let them. And your body is settling further into wherever you have chosen to be, the specific, comfortable weight of a person who has stopped resisting the pull of rest. You are welcome here. The story continues, and it continues at the pace of iron moving through a mountain country at the beginning of winter, which is to say it continues with a steadiness that the landscape itself seems to ratify. He came back to Latveria from the east, through the mountain passes that still carried the specific smell of the country he had grown up in, stone and pine, and the cold that the mountains produced without effort or intention. The country looked as it had always looked from this approach. The valley settlements compact and grey in the winter light, the castle of the Baron visible on the ridge above them. The kind of architectural statement that power makes when power has decided that visibility is its primary argument. Victor looked at the castle with the eyes of someone who has spent their entire life understanding exactly what it represented, and who has now, for the first time, the tools to make his understanding consequential. The overthrow of the Baron has been told in various registers across the history of Doom's documentation, sometimes as conquest, sometimes as liberation, sometimes as the straightforward application of superior force to an inferior obstacle. All of these framings contain something true, and all of them miss the quality that made the event meaningful in a register beyond the merely military. Victor did not take Latveria the way conquerors take things, which is to say, he did not take it in order to extract from it what his predecessor had been extracting. He took it in order to govern it, which is a different act performed with a different set of assumptions about what the relationship between a ruler and a population is supposed to produce. The Baron had treated Latveria as a resource. Victor intended to treat it as an argument. The argument was this, that the conditions under which the Latverian people lived were not the result of their limitations or their failures, or the specific arrangement of cosmic favor, but the result of governance that served itself rather than the people it governed, and that governance of a different quality would produce, demonstrably and measurably, a different quality of life. He was going to prove this. He was going to prove it not by announcing it, but by doing it, and the doing of it would constitute the evidence that the announcement alone never could. He built. This is what the historical record of Doom's early governance shows, with a consistency that requires engagement rather than dismissal. He built. The infrastructure that Latveria had lacked, the systems of distribution that ensured the population was fed, the institutions that maintained the country's internal order, without resorting to the arbitrary application of force that the Baron's administration had normalized, the framework of basic provision that converted a population perpetually managing scarcity into a population with sufficient security to develop the other dimensions of human life that scarcity had been preventing. He did this with the same total and organized attention he brought to any problem, treating governance as an engineering challenge, a system requiring design and optimization, rather than simply administration and extraction. Travelers who came to Latveria in the years following Victor's accession were frequently disoriented by what they found. They had been prepared by his reputation and by the association of absolute rule with the specific kind of misery that absolute rule tends to produce in the historical record for a population living in fear under the iron hand of a tyrant. They found something different. They found a country that was, by meaningful measures, functioning. Crime was low because the material desperation that produces most crime had been addressed at the structural level rather than the punitive one. The streets were maintained. The distribution of food was reliable. The medical provision was substantially better than what existed in neighboring regions. Children were educated. Old people were cared for. The particular daily texture of life in Latveria was not the texture of a country under the heel of oppression. It was, more disquietingly for people who needed their categories to remain stable, the texture of a country that was being governed well. The question this raised was one that visitors found it difficult to ask cleanly, because the clean asking of it required acknowledging a premise that most of the world's political philosophy had spent considerable energy avoiding. What if absolute authority, applied by a genuinely capable person with a genuine commitment to the welfare of the governed, produced better outcomes than the distributed and contested authority of democratic systems? Victor was not confused about this question. He had asked it himself many years before he was in a position to test it, and he had arrived at an answer that he was now in the process of demonstrating. The answer was yes, and the yes was conditional on the same condition that made almost every system conditional, which was the quality of the person or persons operating it. But that conditionality did not make the answer wrong. He never lied to his people. This is the element of his governance that most outside observers found most difficult to reconcile with their existing model of Victor von Doom, and it is the element that reveals most clearly what the model was missing. He made decrees and kept them. He made promises and fulfilled them. He issued threats and followed through on them with the same exactitude, because the code did not distinguish between positive and negative obligations. A threat not kept was as much a failure of integrity as a promise not kept. And Victor's integrity, whatever the world thought of the architecture he built it into, was not something he was willing to compromise for the sake of convenience or comfort or the kind of strategic ambiguity that most rulers maintain because they have decided that flexibility is more valuable than reliability. He had decided otherwise. His word was absolute. The people of Latveria knew this, and the knowledge of it produced in them a relationship with their ruler that was not the relationship of a population living in the shadow of unpredictable power, but something stranger and, in its way, more stable. He was not warm. This should be said, because the portrait of Doom as benevolent ruler can slide, if it is not careful, into something sentimental that Victor himself would refuse. He was not warm in the way that leaders who want to be loved are warm. He did not make himself available for the kind of intimate connection that elected officials cultivate with their populations as a form of legitimacy. He was remote, armored in fact as well as in the literal sense, present in the administration of his country, and entirely absent from the social performances of governance. What he offered was not love, not even the performance of love, but something his people came to understand as more reliable than love, which was competence in service of their welfare, consistently applied, without the discontinuities that love introduces when it is allowed to govern. The Fantastic Four came eventually, as they always did. They came with the assumption that a man who had taken power by force and who ruled without the oversight of democratic institutions was, by definition, a problem requiring heroic intervention. They found a country that did not want to be intervened in, a population that looked at the offer of liberation from their ruler and did not recognize the thing being described as the thing they were living. And they found Victor himself, in his castle on the ridge, entirely willing to receive them and entirely unintimidated by their arrival. The confrontations that followed over the subsequent decades were many and varied and frequently dramatic in the sense that things involving Reed Richards and Victor von Doom tend to be dramatic, but they were also, from Victor's perspective, a form of evidence. Every time Latveria remained stable and the people remained cared for while these confrontations played out, every time the country demonstrated that its governance could absorb external pressure without producing the kind of internal collapse that would have validated the heroic intervention narrative, the argument Victor was making with his life became more difficult to dismiss. The code that governed his public life extended into the private dimensions of his rule with the same completeness. He did not exempt himself from the requirements he imposed on the country. He did not extract resources from Latveria for personal enrichment in the way that most rulers, absolute or otherwise, at least partially do. The castle and what it contained were instruments of governance, not trophies of personal acquisition. The country's resources were the country's resources. Victor von Doom, whatever he was collecting, was not collecting those. This distinction, again, was difficult for outside observers to process cleanly because it required separating the man from the category they had assigned him. And categories are more comfortable than particularities, especially when the particularities complicate narratives that serve important functions. What the rule of Latveria revealed, for those willing to look at it without the distorting lens of the narrative the world needed Victor to inhabit, was a man who had decided very early that the test of any governing philosophy was not its internal consistency, but its outcomes, not how it sounded when described, but what it produced when applied. And the outcomes in Latveria were not the outcomes that the world's conventional wisdom about absolute authority would have predicted. They were, by most measures, better. The argument was not made in words. It was made in the conditions of daily life for a population that had before Victor been used as a resource, and that, after Victor, was being treated as the point of the entire enterprise. Whether that argument was sufficient to answer all the legitimate questions about democratic legitimacy and individual rights that it raised was a different conversation, one Victor was always willing to have and never willing to concede entirely. But the argument was there. It was built from stone and infrastructure, and the particular quality of a promise kept. And it was going to be there for as long as Victor was, which was something he had also arranged. The specific decisions he made in the first years of his governance are worth examining at a level of detail that the historical summary tends to skip, because the detail is where the argument lives. He invested the country's resources, which were limited in the way that small mountainous countries tend to have limited resources, in the infrastructure of basic welfare first, food distribution, medical provision, shelter before any other priority. He did this not because it was politically expedient, not because a population with fed children and adequate shelter is a more governable population than a population in material desperation, though that is also true, and he was certainly aware of it, but because it was correct. The people of Latveria had spent decades being governed by a system that extracted from them what they produced and returned almost nothing. The moral logic of reversal was, to Victor, elementary. He was thorough in its application. The scholars who have examined the Latverian economic model from outside Latveria have found in it a genuine and unresolved puzzle. By the standards that the Marvel Universe's democratic institutions apply when assessing the welfare of populations under various governance structures, Latveria rates well, the poverty rate is low, the education provision is adequate. The public health indicators are better than those of several of Latveria's more conventionally governed neighbours. The civil rights picture is more complicated, and the scholars who have engaged with this complication honestly have found that it is genuinely complicated rather than a simple case of rights denied to a population that wanted them. What the Latverian population has surrendered is the formal apparatus of democratic participation. What it has received in exchange is the consistent delivery of what democratic participation is ostensibly supposed to produce. The trade is not one that most political philosophers can cleanly recommend. It is also not one that most political philosophers can cleanly condemn, which is the part that makes them most uncomfortable. Victor received the delegations that came from various nations and institutions to discuss the Latverian situation with the same courtesy he extended to everyone who came to him without declaring hostile intent, which was the courtesy of a man who will tell you exactly what he thinks and will listen to what you think, and who has made his decisions and is not going to unmake them because you have opinions about them. The delegations left, as delegations typically did, with a great deal to report and no clear sense of what to do with what they had found. He was not the thing they had prepared to find. He was not the thing they had prepared to not find. He was a specific person running a specific country by specific principles, and the specificity refused to resolve into either the villain or the cautionary tale that the framework required. The breath is slower now. Feel it. The body knows how to do this, knows how to settle into the rhythm that rest requires. And it has been moving in that direction all along, carrying you toward the quiet that is already waiting for you underneath the noise of the day. Let the temperature seem to drop slightly, the way temperature drops when you descend, when you go deeper into something than you have been before. You are going somewhere that requires going down. The story requires it. Follow it without resistance. There is one thing that Victor von Doom does every year that almost no one knows about, and that the few people who do know about it are never quite sure how to hold. It is not a military campaign. It is not an act of acquisition or demonstration or revenge. It is a vigil, performed annually, in private, at the cost of resources and risks that most entities would consider prohibitive, for the sake of a woman who has been gone since Victor was a child. Every year, on the anniversary of Cynthia von Doom's damnation, Victor descends into the realm that Mephisto has constructed from the accumulated weight of what people most fear and most regret, and he tries to bring her home. He has never succeeded. He has never stopped. To understand what this means, you have to understand where he is going. Mephisto's realm is not a place in the geographic sense, though it has geography, and the geography is specific and can be mapped in the way that specific places can be mapped. It is a place constructed from the psychological material of the beings Mephisto has collected, the fears and griefs and regrets that he has gathered over an existence that predates human civilization, and that he has arranged into an environment that reflects back to its inhabitants the things they can least afford to look at. It is, in other words, a place designed to be maximally difficult for the particular entity who is visiting it, which means that for Victor von Doom, it is a place organized around the very specific combination of guilt and grief, and the question of whether his mother's condition is something he could have prevented if he had been, at the relevant moment, different. He goes anyway, every year, in the iron, in the cold, in the armor that is also a prayer and also a weapon, and also, in this specific context, a form of protection against an environment that is trying, with the full sophistication of Mephisto's understanding of what Victor most fears, to break him. He negotiates, he argues, he sometimes fights, in the specific sense that one fights with an entity whose power exceeds human measurement by the same interval that makes the fight almost certainly futile, which is to say one fights with the knowledge that the fighting is not primarily about winning, but about refusing to not fight. He has never returned empty-handed from these descents, in the sense of having learned nothing or accomplished nothing. He has returned without his mother every single time. The rose is the thing that, when you learn about it, changes the entire architecture of what you thought you understood about the man in the iron. Victor makes a rose. He makes it from petals that have been treated through a combination of botanical and sorcerer's technique to retain their bloom even in the absence of sunlight, and even in the specific cold that Mephisto's realm maintains. As a statement about what warmth costs and who has access to it. He makes the rose, and he takes it with him when he descends, and he leaves it somewhere in the constructed landscape of the realm where his mother might conceivably encounter it. He cannot reach her directly. Mephisto's custody is more sophisticated than the kind of custody that can be breached by a frontal approach, but the rose can move through the realm in ways that Victor himself cannot. And the hope is that somewhere in the dimension where Cynthia von Doom has been held since before her son first grew into himself, there is a rose blooming in the dark, and she finds it. And it tells her that he has not forgotten, and that he is still coming, and that he is not finished. Let that image rest with you for a moment. The most feared ruler in the Marvel Universe, armored in iron from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, carrying a rose into the dimension where his mother's soul is held. There is no performance here, no audience, no strategic advantage to be gained from the act. The realm he is entering is one that operates entirely on the terms of the entities who inhabit it, and those terms are hostile to his success. He is going because she is his mother, because she was taken by something that has remained in his possession since the winter in Latveria when his father died, and she was gone, and the cold was absolute, and the world demonstrated clearly and completely that it did not consider his losses a matter of its concern. He went to the monastery. He built the armor. He took the country. He governed it as proof. And every year he goes back down into the dark for the one thing none of those other acts have been able to accomplish. Sit with that. Let the story hold this moment without moving past it, because this is the moment that the rest of the story depends on for its emotional truth, and moving past it too quickly leaves the essential thing unexamined. Victor von Doom has been constructed by the narrative traditions that grew up around him as a villain, as a man defined by his resentments and his ambitions and his unwillingness to accept a subordinate position in any hierarchy. All of that is true, in the specific way that the visible surface of a thing is true. What is also true, and what the descent into Mephisto's realm reveals, with a clarity that none of the other chapters of his history manage, is that underneath the iron and the resentment and the ambition and the extraordinary intelligence directed at the project of self-sufficiency, there is a sun. There has always been a sun. The sun has never stopped being the sun, which means that the mother has never stopped being the mother, which means that the loss has never stopped being the loss, and that all of the building and conquering and fighting has been, at some level, underneath the level where such things are visible. A boy in a dead man's coat, looking for a way to make the world give back what it took. Mephisto understands this. He is, whatever else he is, an extremely sophisticated reader of the human condition, and he has been studying Victor von Doom for longer than Victor has been studying himself. He knows what the rose means. He knows what the annual descent costs. He knows that the cost is precisely the point, that Victor would not value the endeavor if it were easy, that the impossibility of the task is part of what makes the commitment to it the most genuine thing in Victor's life. This understanding does not make Mephisto sympathetic toward the effort. It makes him more effective at making the effort fail. He is, in this specific relationship, the adversary that Victor most deserves, which is to say, an adversary who operates at the level of the thing Victor most deeply is, rather than the level of the things Victor most visibly does. The heroes who have been aware of these annual descents, and there have been several over the decades, have reacted to the information with a range of responses that says as much about them as it does about Victor. Some have found in it what they hope to find, which is evidence that the man they have been fighting is not irredeemably what they have categorized him as, that there is a register in which he is simply human, carrying the particular weight that humans carry when they have lost something that cannot be recovered through any of the means they have available. Others have found it unsettling in a different way, because it complicates the clean lines of the conflict in ways that are difficult to manage operationally. If Victor von Doom descends into hell every year for his mother, and the descent has failed every time, and he keeps going, then what exactly is the correct moral accounting of the man? The question does not have a clean answer, which is part of why it tends to be set aside rather than engaged with directly. What the question points toward, if it is not set aside, is the architecture of Victor's relationship with failure. He is a man who will not accept failure in any external domain, who rewrites defeats as delays and losses as redirections, and who has the specific quality of focus that makes people who are focused in this way genuinely dangerous across very long time scales. But in the domain of his mother's soul, he has been failing for decades, and he has not rewritten those failures as anything. He has not developed a framework that makes them acceptable or productive or part of a larger strategy. He returns each year knowing he will likely fail, and having no alternative to returning anyway. And this is, for someone of his temperament, not a tolerance of failure, but something more unusual, something closer to love, which is the only human experience that produces this particular combination of full knowledge, of likely failure, and absolute inability to stop trying. The rose blooms in the dimension where the light is constructed rather than natural, and where warmth is a negotiating position rather than a condition. It blooms because Victor made it to bloom, using the synthesis of science and sorcery that he has spent his life building toward, encoding into the petals a persistence that the ordinary laws of the realm cannot simply override. It is a small act of defiance in a context where defiance is almost entirely futile. It is also, in its specific, private, unobserved way, the truest thing Victor von Doom has ever done. Every iron declaration, every conquest, every confrontation with gods and heroes and cosmic powers has the quality of performance, of a man who is aware that history is watching and who performs accordingly. The rose has none of that quality. The rose is for his mother in the dark, where no one can see him make it, and that is the thing it is, and nothing else. The annual descent continues. The rose continues to bloom in the dark, and the most powerful man in Latveria continues to carry, underneath the iron and the title and the reputation, the specific wound that has never fully closed, and that he has built an entire life around, and that he would not trade if the trading were possible, because trading it would mean trading the fact that she mattered, and she did matter, and she does. And in whatever dimension she is held in, she still does. The breath comes slowly now. The story moves forward, but it moves forward carrying this. The way a river carries the specific temperature of the source it came from, all the way to the sea. The river changes, the temperature remains. The negotiations with Mephisto, in the years when they have taken the form of negotiation rather than combat, are documented in the fragmentary way that encounters with Mephisto tend to be documented, with significant portions of what was actually said remaining in the private record of the parties involved, rather than in any accessible history. What is known is that Victor approaches these conversations with the same preparation he brings to any high-stakes encounter, having researched Mephisto's existing agreements, the terms he has previously accepted and previously refused, the specific patterns in his dealing that reveal what he values and what he considers beneath his time. Victor comes to Mephisto's realm not simply as a grieving son, but as a negotiator who has done the work, who has studied the entity across the table with the same thoroughness he would study any adversary before a confrontation that mattered. Mephisto respects this, in the way that Mephisto respects anything, which is to say with a dark amusement that contains, somewhere inside its darkness, a quality that might almost be called appreciation. What the descent into Mephisto's realm does to Victor internally, in the days and weeks after each unsuccessful attempt, is something that is not visible in the armor, and not visible in his governance, and not visible in his dealings with any of the external world, but that those who have known him across many years can detect in the specific quality of his silence in that period. A silence that is deeper than his ordinary silence, and that carries a weight that his ordinary silence does not. He does not speak about it. He does not process it externally in any form that anyone around him can access. He carries it back from the realm in the same iron that carried him in, and it goes, the weight of it, into whatever internal structure he has built for carrying things that cannot be set down. And the structure holds because he built it to hold, and the holding is the thing he does instead of the breaking. That would, for any other person, be the predictable outcome of this specific and recurring loss. Let the breath settle. You have been somewhere difficult, somewhere that required more of you than most places do, and the body knows this and is responding to it in the way the body responds to things it has absorbed, by going quieter, by pulling the warmth inward, by doing the slow interior work that rest makes possible. Let it do that work now. The story is not finished, but it is moving into a different register, into the space between two great minds that have been circling each other for decades, like binary stars, each one defining the other's position by the force of their mutual gravity. You know both of them. You have always known both of them. You just did not know, until now, what you are actually watching. There is a question at the center of the Marvel Universe that has never been cleanly resolved, and the reason it has never been cleanly resolved is not that the evidence is insufficient, but that the question itself is more complicated than the framing usually allows. The question is, who is smarter, Victor Von Doom or Reed Richards? The conventional answer, the one that the narrative architecture tends to support, is Reed Richards, because Reed is the hero and heroes are supposed to be the best at the things that matter. But the conventional answer rests on a very specific definition of smart, and Victor would argue, with considerable supporting evidence, that the definition is partial. Reed Richards is brilliant in the way that certain people are brilliant who have never experienced the specific condition of having no resources and no institutional support, and no access to the networks through which knowledge and funding flow, and who have nonetheless had to construct their understanding of the world from first principles using whatever was available. Reed had access. Reed had support. Reed had the infrastructure that amplifies genius, that provides genius with the tools and the collaborators and the accumulated prior work that make it possible for genius to push past what any individual working alone could reach. He has used those resources with extraordinary effectiveness. His contributions to science and to the defense of the planet are real and documented and significant. None of this is in dispute. Victor built everything he knows in Latveria, in a mountain country with limited educational resources, while simultaneously managing the grief of 2 parental losses and the awareness, growing in him from childhood, that the world was organized in ways that actively worked against people like him. He built it with no support infrastructure, no institutional amplification, no network of brilliant colleagues bouncing ideas back and forth over shared meals and whiteboards. He built a synthesis of science and sorcery that did not exist before he built it, using models he constructed himself because the existing models were inadequate to what he was trying to understand. He then took that synthesis and applied it to the governance of a country, to the construction of military and defensive technology, to the design of armor that integrates mystical and mechanical function at a level that no existing discipline could have produced, and to the ongoing project of accessing a realm that exists outside the conventional parameters of the physical universe. He did all of this largely alone. The rivalry between them is not, at its root, a scientific rivalry. Science is the medium in which it is conducted, the way that a legal dispute between 2 parties is conducted in the language of law without being fundamentally about the law. What the rivalry is about is something older and simpler and less manageable than any intellectual question, which is the need of 2 people who are each, in their own assessment, uniquely capable to find out where their edge is, to find the place where their reach ends. And the only way to find that place is to press against someone whose reach is long enough to provide meaningful resistance. Victor cannot find his edge by pressing against people who run out of reach quickly. Most people run out of reach very quickly. Reed does not. Reed is, in the register where these things matter, the only person in Victor's world who has ever provided the kind of resistance that makes the pressing meaningful. This is what makes the rivalry irreplaceable, and what makes it, from Victor's perspective, not entirely separable from something that functions like gratitude, though gratitude is not a word he would use, and the process of reaching the word would require navigating past several layers of architecture that he has built specifically to make such reaching difficult. Reed Richards is the only measuring line Victor has that does not immediately give way. A life without that measuring line would be, for someone of Victor's construction, not freer, but more constricted, because the freedom that comes from having no constraints, and the freedom that comes from operating at the limit of your capability are completely different kinds of freedom, and Victor has always been interested only in the second kind. Consider the specific texture of their encounters, not the dramatic ones, not the confrontations that make it into the public record, as events requiring resolution, but the quieter moments that the record catches at the edges. The moments when Victor, having come to some conclusion about a problem that has occupied him for months, presents that conclusion in a context where Richards is present, and the look that passes across Richards's face as he processes what he is hearing is not the look of an enemy receiving unwelcome news, but the look of a mind encountering something it finds genuinely interesting. And the look that passes across Victor's face in that moment, visible only through the quality of his stillness, is something that could be called recognition. Could be called, though again the word requires considerable navigation to reach, something like satisfaction. Not at the defeat of an enemy, at the acknowledgement of a peer. The question of the calculation, the one that scarred his face and expelled him from the university, lives inside this dynamic with particular weight. Because if the calculation was correct, if the error Richards identified was not an error, then what the history of their rivalry contains at its foundation is a misunderstanding so complete that neither of them can fully address it without dismantling the framework that both of them have built their enmity inside of. Victor cannot concede that his calculation might have been correct without conceding that the explosion was not Reed's fault, and was not his own fault, and was, perhaps simply a consequence of the interaction between two exceptional minds in a moment of tension that neither of them fully controlled. Reed cannot concede that he might have been wrong without conceding that his well-intentioned intervention set in motion a sequence of events whose cost was enormous, and that the cost cannot be redistributed to anyone else's account. So neither of them fully makes the concession, and the rivalry continues on the terms that both of them need it to continue on. And underneath those terms, in the space where the honest accounting would have to live if anyone were keeping it, the question sits unanswered. Tony Stark once observed in conversation that the difference between Victor Von Doom and Reed Richards was that Richards genuinely wanted to understand the universe, and Victor genuinely wanted the universe to understand him. This is an elegant formulation, and Tony, characteristically, was proud of it. It is also characteristically partially correct and partially a projection of Tony's own orientation onto a dynamic he was watching from the outside. The truth is more symmetric. Both men want to be understood. Both men want the universe to look back at them and see what they have built and register what it took to build it. The difference is that Reed has, in the Fantastic Four and in Sue, and in the collaborative infrastructure of his life, a structure that provides that witnessing on a relatively consistent basis. Victor has Latveria, which provides it in a political rather than personal register, and he has his annual confrontations with forces that provide it in the adversarial register, and he has Reed Richards, who provides it in the only register that actually counts, which is the register of someone who is qualified to look at what you have done and know what it was that you did. There was a moment, not recorded in any official documentation but reported by those who were present, when Victor was presented with a problem that had been defeating Reed's team for months. A dimensional stability issue of the kind that sits at the intersection of physics and sorcery, and that Reed's purely scientific framework was not equipped to fully model. Victor solved it. He solved it in an afternoon, alone, using the synthesis that Reed's framework had no equivalent for. When the solution was presented, Reed looked at it for a long time without speaking, and what he said when he finally spoke was not a challenge or a concession or an acknowledgement of defeat. What he said was, "I would not have thought of that approach." And what he meant, which everyone in the room understood, was, "This is a thing that I could not have done, and I know what that means, and I am telling you that I know it." Victor received this in silence. He received it with the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a particular thing, and who, now that it has arrived, cannot afford to let it show how much it mattered. The rivalry is ongoing. It will not resolve in the way that rivalries in stories usually resolve, with one party winning definitively and the other conceding what the narrative has required them to concede. It will continue because the continuation is the point. The specific friction between these two minds, the warmth produced by two things that are almost identical pressing against each other, is the condition under which both of them do their best and most important work. Take it away, and both of them would be diminished. Neither of them would admit this, but both of them, at the level where admissions of this kind live, already know it. The story moves forward, always forward, and what it carries with it from this chapter is the image of two men in adjacent rooms, each solving the universe in their own language, each glancing at the wall between them with the specific attention of someone who cannot quite decide whether they want it to come down. The wall stays up, the glancing continues, and in the space between them, in the friction, in the refusal of either one to simply concede the argument and walk away, something is being made that could not be made any other way. And both of them are making it, and neither of them would trade the making of it for the peace that ending it would bring. The nature of the thing they are making together, through their rivalry, through the decades of confrontation and occasional reluctant cooperation, is the thing that the history books of the Marvel Universe have not yet found the right language for. They have the language of enemies, of rivals, of opposing forces in the moral architecture of superhero narrative. What they do not have is the language for what happens when two people who are as nearly each other as these two men are, spend 50 years pressing against each other hard enough to change the shape of both of them. Reed Richards is not the same scientist he would have been without Victor Von Doom. The specific problems he has most deeply engaged with, the dimensional questions, the questions at the frontier where physics and sorcery become indistinguishable from each other, are the problems that Victor's work in those territories made undeniable. And Victor is not the same man he would have been without Richards, though the ways in which Richards has shaped him are less visible because they are the ways that resistance shapes the thing resisting, which is to say they are structural, rather than surface. There are, in the documented history of their interactions, a small number of moments when the framing drops and the thing underneath it is briefly visible, when the performance of the rivalry gives way to something that functions in those moments as its inverse. Victor has consulted Richards on problems in pure science that required a level of mathematical sophistication that Victor acknowledged, by the act of consulting, exceeded what he himself could bring to them in the available time. Richards has consulted Victor on problems in the dimensional and mystical domains that Richards's framework could not adequately address without the specific kind of help that only Victor's synthesis could provide. These consultations are conducted with efficiency and brevity, and without any of the ceremony that would draw attention to their nature, because acknowledging their nature would require acknowledging something about the relationship that neither of them is prepared to acknowledge in full. But the consultations happen. They have been happening for decades. And the fact that they happen is the most honest thing either of them has said to the other without speaking. Let the body be heavy now. Let it be the specific and welcome heaviness of someone who has been holding themselves upright all day, and who has decided at last that the holding is done for tonight, that the surface will hold them instead, that the exchange between the body and wherever it rests is allowed to run in this direction for a while. Your breath is slower, your mind is quieter than it was. The story is moving into a different kind of space, into the place where science and sorcery meet, where the languages that describe the world overlap and produce, in their overlapping, a register that neither language alone can access. Come there slowly. There is no hurry. The dimension of sorcery in Victor von Doom's story is the one that most accounts treat as secondary, as decoration on top of the primary structure of the scientific and technological genius that produces the armor and the machines and the dimensional devices. This treatment is not simply inaccurate. It is the inaccuracy that most fundamentally misrepresents what Victor actually is, and what his actual capability actually amounts to. He is not a scientist who also does magic. He is not a sorcerer who also builds machines. He is something that has no clean prior example in the history of either discipline, a person for whom the distinction between the material and the mystical is a taxonomic convenience rather than a meaningful boundary, who operates in both with the same depth and the same rigor, and who has built, at their intersection, a third discipline that only he practices because only he thought to build it. The tradition his mother gave him before she was taken was an old one. Old in the sense that it predated the institutions that most people in the Marvel Universe associate with the practice of sorcery. Older than the orders and the academies and the hierarchies of titles like Sorcerer Supreme that structure the mystical community's sense of itself. It was the knowledge of people who had been working with the forces beneath the surface of the world for long enough that the working had become integrated into the way they understood reality, rather than being a separate specialized practice layered on top of a more fundamental understanding. Cynthia had passed it to him in fragments, in the way that knowledge gets passed when time is short and the full transmission is not possible. He had spent his years in Latveria and in the monastery, and in all of the spaces in between reconstructing what the fragments implied, inferring the larger system from the pieces he had, which is a form of learning that requires not just intelligence, but imagination, the ability to see what is not yet visible, and to treat the gap as a map rather than an obstacle. He was, by the time he came fully into his capability, operating at a level of sorcerous power that placed him in company with the most significant practitioners in the Marvel Universe. Not at the summit of that company, because the summit of that company is defined by the title that comes with specific cosmic authorization and specific cosmic responsibility. And Victor had not sought that title, and was not likely to be given it, for reasons that had as much to do with the politics of the mystical community's power structures as with any limitation of Victor's capability, but near the summit. Close enough that practitioners at the summit were aware of his proximity and were not entirely comfortable with it. Doctor Strange is the obvious comparison. Victor would not welcome the comparison because Victor does not welcome comparisons that position him as a version of someone else rather than as an original, but the comparison is structurally illuminating regardless of whether it is welcome. Both men are extraordinary sorcerers who came to the mystic arts through crisis rather than through institutional training. Both men are also exceptional in their respective non-magical domains, Strange in medicine and Victor in engineering, and both have built identities in which the sorceress and the non-sorceress dimensions are genuinely integrated rather than artificially combined. Both chose a kind of solitude as the price of their mastery. Both operate with an authority in their domains that does not depend on others' validation to function. The difference between them, in the dimension that matters most for understanding what each of them chose, is in the relationship each has with the specific title that their tradition offers as its highest designation. Strange pursued the title of Sorcerer Supreme with a commitment that was, in the early years, entirely personal, and had to become something more before it could be genuinely held. The title chose him, eventually, but the choosing was the result of a long process of his becoming the kind of person the title could choose. Victor has never pursued that title. The question of whether he could have it, whether his capability would support the claim, is a question that mystic scholars debate with more seriousness than most people realize, and the answer that the more careful scholars tend to arrive at is probably. He probably has the capability. He chose not to pursue it, which is a different kind of answer than not being able to pursue it, and Victor is extremely clear about the distinction. He chose the synthesis. He chose the armor, the specific object that holds both traditions simultaneously, that encodes sorcery into the structure of metal, in a way that makes the two inseparable, that makes every technological function also a mystical function, and every mystical capability also a technological one. He chose this because the synthesis was what no one else had built. And building what no one else has built is, for Victor, not merely a preference, but a principle. To be the best at a thing that others also do, even to be the unambiguous best, is a smaller achievement than to be the only one who does the thing at all. The armor is his, completely and irreducibly his. No one else could build it, because no one else is both things that it requires you to be to build it. The mystical tradition within which Victor operates also gives him access to dimensions and entities and forces that lie outside the reach of purely technological approaches. And this access is not peripheral to his broader capabilities, but central to them. The annual descent into Mephisto's realm, for example, requires sorcerous navigation that no amount of scientific sophistication could substitute for. The encoding of mystical properties into his armor's structure requires an understanding of the deeper forces of the world that no purely empirical framework has successfully modeled. The specific things Victor can do that Reed Richards cannot do are, to a significant degree, the things that require the sorcerous dimension. And this is not a coincidence, but the deliberate product of Victor having designed his capabilities to include what Reed's capabilities exclude. Let the mind rest in this for a moment, in the space where two languages overlap, where the physics of the universe and the older, less mapped forces that physics has not yet found adequate models for press against each other and produce, in the pressing, a territory that belongs to neither and to both. This is where Victor works. This is the laboratory that is also a monastery, and the monastery that is also a laboratory. The space inside the iron that holds the equations and the incantations with equal seriousness because they are equal, because they are both descriptions of the same underlying reality using different notation systems. And the person who can move between those notation systems with fluency is a person whose understanding of that underlying reality exceeds the understanding of anyone who is confined to just one. There is something in the relationship between mastery and solitude that Victor's story makes visible, something that is also present in Strange's story, and in the story of anyone who has gone deep enough into a domain that the view from that depth is not easily shared with people who have not made the same descent. The further you go into a discipline, the fewer companions there are at your depth. And the specific loneliness of operating at the frontier of what human understanding has so far managed to reach is not easily described to people who are operating in the more populated middle distances. Victor did not create this situation. He simply followed his nature to its logical extent. And his nature, followed to its logical extent, produced the very high altitude of his capability and the very thin air of companionship that altitude involves. The sorcery did not make him less himself. This is worth saying, because the assumption that the mystical tradition would soften him, would introduce into his operating framework some element of humility or cosmic perspective that would modify the harder lines of his character, is an assumption that the evidence does not support. He brought the same quality of attention to sorcerer's study that he brought to scientific study, which is to say the attention of someone who is extracting from the tradition what it genuinely contains, and refusing to accept what it merely performs, who is interested in what works and indifferent to what is simply decorative. The mystical community found him, as the scientific community had found him, simultaneously extraordinary and difficult. He found them, as he found most communities, useful up to a point, and beyond that point, irrelevant. What the synthesis gave him was not peace or wisdom or any of the softer things that disciplines of this kind are sometimes associated with producing in their practitioners. What it gave him was completeness. The specific sense of having all the instruments required for the work, of not being dependent on any single tradition for the capability the work requires, of having built the thing that could not be built by anyone who was only one of the things that it required him to be. He stands in the iron, in the cold, at the intersection of the scientific and the mystical. And the standing is itself the achievement, the proof, the answer to the question he has been asking since the mountains of Latveria, and the boy in the coat, and the grief that became architecture. He is everything the world said he could not be. He is precisely and deliberately that. And the building continues, because for Victor von Doom, the building always continues. The practical dimension of the synthesis, the way it functions in the moment of application rather than in the abstract, is something that can only be understood by watching Victor work in a context where both elements are being deployed simultaneously, which is to say in almost any context where Victor is working at the limits of his capability rather than well within them. The armor channels the sorcerous energy as structure rather than as fuel, meaning that the magical dimension of what he does is not something he calls upon separately from the mechanical dimension, but something that is already active, already integrated into the physical operation of every system in the suit. When he reaches into the dimensional level of reality to manipulate something, the technology is performing that reach through a framework that the sorcery has made possible. When he deploys the technology to build or break or cross a threshold, the sorcery is what makes the technology capable of operating at that threshold at all. Neither dimension is primary. Both are equally load-bearing. The tradition he inherited from his mother had at its center a particular understanding of the relationship between the practitioner and the forces they worked with, an understanding that differed significantly from the understanding embedded in the more institutional forms of sorcerous practice that characterized organizations like the Masters of the Mystic Arts that Strange operated within. The institutional understanding tends toward mediation, toward the sorcerer as a conduit for forces that exceed the sorcerer and that must be handled with the specific humility appropriate to working with something vastly larger than yourself. His mother's tradition understood the practitioner differently, as a participant in a conversation rather than a channel for a current, as someone whose own nature and capability and intention contributed actively to the shape of what the working produced, rather than simply providing the vessel through which the force moved. This distinction is not merely philosophical. It produces different practitioners, with different relationships to their own agency in the work. And Victor's relationship to his own agency has never been one that welcomed the conduit model. The sorcerous community's awareness of Victor exists in a register of complexity that makes the scientific community's awareness of him look simple. The scientists have a clear framework for processing him. He is a peer of extraordinary capability who has made choices they disapprove of. The sorcerous community does not have a clear framework, because the framework the sorcerous community uses to understand its members is built on a set of principles about the proper use of the forces involved. And Victor's relationship with those principles is not one of violation or disregard, but one of principled disagreement about what the principles should be. He has never used his sorcerous capability for the kinds of ends that the mystical tradition would classify as genuinely dark, not in the way that practitioners who have been consumed by the forces they work with use them, not in the way that the tradition's cautionary histories describe. He has used them for his own ends, which are not the community's ends, and the community has not been entirely sure what to do with this. They watch him. He watches them. The watching continues. The breath is very slow now. Let it be slower. There is no requirement on you tonight except the requirement to rest. And rest is asking so little of you, only that you stop, only that you allow the body to do what it was designed to do in the absence of urgency. The story is moving into its larger space, into the silence that exists between universes, into a moment when the ordinary scale of everything collapsed into something so extreme that even the language we use to describe large things becomes insufficient. Follow it into that silence. You are safe in the quiet. The Beyonders were not villains in any sense that the word villain is usually applied. They were not adversaries with goals, in conflict with the goals of the Marvel Universe's inhabitants. Not in the way that Thanos had goals, or Magneto had goals, or even Mephisto had goals. They were something closer to what forces of nature are, except that forces of nature are indifferent, and the Beyonders were, in their particular way, purposeful. Their purpose was the termination of the multiverse. Not the destruction exactly, not the dramatic annihilation that the word destruction implies, but the termination, the ending of the experiment, the conclusion of a process that had been running for long enough that its originators had decided to bring it to a close. They were not cruel. Cruelty requires caring about the suffering of the thing you are causing to suffer. The Beyonders were simply thorough. The plan they put in motion was almost perfectly conceived. It operated not by attacking the multiverse from the outside, which would have been detectable and resistible, and which would have alerted the multiverse's defenders to the threat in time to mount some form of response. It operated from the inside, using mechanisms embedded in the structure of reality itself, a cascade of events timed to produce the sequential collapse of all possible realities within a window too narrow for conventional defensive responses to address. Universe after universe was going to end. And then another after that, and then another, until the architecture of everything that could exist had been reduced to whatever the Beyonders intended to build in the space where it had been. It was elegant in the specific cold way that plans are elegant when their elegance is inseparable from their lethality. Victor Von Doom saw it coming. This is the thing about the Beyonders' plan that its architects apparently did not adequately account for. They did not account for a mind operating at Victor's specific intersection of scientific and sorcerous awareness. With access to dimensional information that most other minds in the Marvel Universe did not have access to, and with the specific willingness to believe in threats of this magnitude before they had produced effects visible to those who needed visible effects in order to believe. Victor saw it, and he did what Victor does when he sees a threat of sufficient scale, which is to immediately begin constructing the response. The response required a theft. Not a small one, not the kind of theft that constitutes ordinary acquisition, but a theft at the scale of cosmic power. The removal from the Beyonders of the energy and authority that constituted their capacity to end everything. He assembled the pieces he needed. The Molecule Man was central, a being who had been seeded across the multiverse by the Beyonders themselves as one of the mechanisms of the planned termination, whose power over molecular reality was precisely the kind of power that could be redirected toward the construction of something rather than the destruction of everything. Victor brought together what he needed and went to where he needed to go and did what he had decided to do, which was to steal the power of the beings who were going to end the universe and use that power to save it instead. He built a world. This is the simplest description of what happened next. And like all simple descriptions of extremely complex things, it is both true and inadequate. Battleworld was what Victor constructed from the pieces of the multiverse he managed to preserve during the collapse. An assembled patchwork of realities held together by the power he had stolen and the will he applied to maintaining it, governed by the absolute authority of a god who was also, still, in the iron, in the cold, the boy from the mountains with his dead father's coat and his mother's sorceress tradition, and his face burned by iron, and his calculation that might have always been right. He was, in that period, God Emperor Doom. The title sounds like grandiosity, like the specific kind of overreach that has always characterized the readings of Victor as villain, as someone who wants too much because he cannot accept having less. But the territory the title described was not grandiosity. It was the actual condition of someone who had acquired the power of the beings who had been about to end everything, and who was using that power to maintain the existence of whatever had survived the ending. He was not governing a delusion. He was governing the only thing left to govern. And he was governing it as he had always governed Latveria, with the specific combination of absolute authority and genuine competence that produces, when it is directed at the welfare of the governed, rather than the extraction of resources from them, something that functions. There were problems. He would be the first to acknowledge that there were problems, and acknowledging problems is something Victor does with a directness that people who expect grandiosity to prevent honest self-assessment consistently find startling. The world he built was not the world that would have been built by someone with better access to the full range of what had existed. It was the world that Victor could build with what he had, which meant it reflected his understanding and his priorities, and his blind spots in ways that a world built by someone without his specific combination of extraordinary capability and characteristic limitation would not. It was his world, genuinely his, in a way that nothing else in his history had been genuinely his in the same full sense, and he ran it with the thoroughness that he ran everything. Then Reed Richards arrived. The arrival was the product of a sequence of events too complex to fully trace here, involving the specific resilience of certain minds and certain relationships against even the most comprehensive of endings. And what arrived in Battleworld with Richards was not the familiar adversary that Victor had been engaging with for decades, but something quieter, something that had survived an ending, and carried the weight of that survival in a way that the version of Reed Victor had been arguing with across 50 years of history had not been carrying. This was not the Reed who was in competition with Victor. This was the Reed who had watched everything end, and was standing in what came after it, and was trying to understand what that meant. They spoke. The conversation that followed exists in the record as one of the most significant exchanges in the history of both men and, by extension, in the history of the Marvel Universe, and its significance lies almost entirely in a single admission that Victor made in the course of it. Reed asked him, in the direct and honest way that Reed asks things when he has stopped managing the performance of their relationship, and is simply asking whether the world Victor had built was the best possible version of what could have been built with what was available. And Victor was silent for a moment. And then he said, "No, you would have done it better." Consider what it cost him to say that. Consider the architecture that statement had to pass through on its way out, the layers of identity and defense, and the specific pride that has been the organizing principle of his self-presentation since the night he pressed the hot mask against his face. He was, at the moment of saying it, literally the most powerful entity in existence, a man who had stolen the power of beings that existed at a scale beyond cosmic measurement, and had used that power to maintain reality itself. And he looked at Reed Richards and said, "You would have done it better." Then he gave Richards the power. He handed the ability to remake everything to the man he had spent his entire adult life arguing was not his equal. And he did it not because he was defeated or coerced or had run out of alternatives. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And Victor Von Doom does the right thing. It is just that the right thing, when it comes from Victor, tends to arrive after a much more complicated journey than it arrives after in most people. The world was remade. The multiverse was restored. The Beyonders' plan was undone. And Victor Von Doom returned to being what he had been before he was everything, which is to say a man in iron in a small country in the mountains, with a mother still in Mephisto's realm, and a face still burned, and a calculation still sitting at the back of everything else, unanswered. The original question that started all of it, still waiting for the moment when it can finally be addressed. The world he built, Battleworld, reflected him in ways that he understood and acknowledged, and in ways that he probably did not. The acknowledged ways were architectural. The order, the specificity of the governance structures he established, the absolute clarity of the rules that governed behavior within the various domains he constructed from the salvaged pieces of collapsed realities. The unacknowledged ways were also architectural. The specific absences in the structure, the places where a different builder might have made different choices about what to preserve and how to relate the preserved domains to each other. The ways in which the world he built was optimized for the governance of it rather than for the flourishing of it. And the difference between these two things is not always visible to the person doing the building. A world designed to be governed is not the same as a world designed to be inhabited, though both are functional and both serve real purposes. This distinction was part of what Richard saw when he arrived, and it was part of what he communicated, as gently as Richard's ever communicated things. In the conversation that followed, the months of Doom's governance of Battleworld were, by the accounts that survived the eventual restoration of the multiverse, not months of tyranny. They were months of a man doing the only thing that a man with Victor von Doom's specific combination of conscience and capability could do in possession of everything, which was to try to make everything work, to try to make it better than it had been when it was collapsing, to try to be adequate to the scale of what he was responsible for. He made mistakes. He acknowledged them to himself with the same honesty he applied to everything that happened to him, because the code that prevented him from lying to others also prevented him from lying to himself, and the mistakes were visible to the honest assessment. He corrected what could be corrected, and held what could not be corrected, and continued, because continuing was the only available alternative to stopping. And stopping was not something Victor von Doom did. The specific quality of the silence that followed his admission to Richards, the silence after you would have done it better, was the silence of a thing that has been true for a long time, and that has been carried in the private register, in the part of the interior that is not available to the world for exactly as long as it has been true, finally being allowed to occupy space in the shared register for the first time. It was not a small silence. It was the kind of silence that contains decades, that has the weight of all the years in which the true thing was being thought and not said. Reed received it in the way that Reed receives most things, with the quality of attention of someone who understands what they are being given and who is choosing their response with care, which is to say slowly and with a respect for the weight of the moment that matched, in its own register, the weight of the admission. What changed between them after Battleworld is difficult to specify precisely, because neither of them has been the kind of person who allows what changes in them to become easily visible. But something did change, in the specific way that something changes when two people have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed, when something true has been said that cannot be unsaid, when the architecture of a relationship has been altered at a foundational level, even if the surface of the relationship continues to look very much as it always did. They still fight. The rivalry still defines the shape of their interactions in every domain where their interests and their territories intersect. But there is something in the fighting now that was not there before, some quality of acknowledgement underneath the confrontation, some awareness in each of them of what the other one costs them and what the other one gives them, that the decades before Battleworld did not contain. The breath comes very slowly now, and that is exactly right. You have been travelling a long way tonight, moving through the architecture of a life that is by any measure extraordinary, and the body knows this and is responding to it in the way the body responds to having carried something significant, by releasing it incrementally, layer by layer, the way a landscape releases the heat of the day as the night deepens. You are almost at the end. The last few things the story has to say are the things that might matter most. The things that the drama and the armor and the scale have been orbiting all along without quite arriving at the center of. The center is here. Come to it quietly. A promise kept when it is inconvenient is not a promise. A promise kept when keeping it costs nothing is a social courtesy. A form of minimal friction management that most functioning adults practice without it saying very much about them. A promise kept when keeping it costs something significant. When the alternative of not keeping it is genuinely available and genuinely appealing. When the breaking of it would produce outcomes that the person breaking it would prefer to the outcomes of keeping it. And when the promise is kept anyway, not because the consequences of breaking it are worse, but because the kind of person who breaks promises under those conditions is not the kind of person the promise keeper has decided to be, that is a different thing entirely. That is what integrity means, in its most concrete form. And Victor von Doom has that, in full, in documented instances across decades, in ways that the Marvel Universe's designated heroes, with their good intentions and their moral flexibility and their willingness to lie when lying seems strategically necessary, demonstrably do not. He never lies. This has been said before, at the beginning of this story, because it is the thing that had to be said first, the thing that the entire edifice rests on in the specific way that surprising structural elements tend to support things that look, from the outside, as though they should be unstable. But it can now be said with more content behind it, with the full weight of the story that was needed to make the saying of it something more than a provocative claim. He never lies. Not to his allies, not to his enemies, not to the cosmic entities he negotiates with, not to the heroes he fights, not to the people he governs. When he makes a statement about the world, the statement is his honest assessment of the world. When he makes a commitment, the commitment will be honored. When he issues a threat, the threat will be carried through if the conditions it specifies are met. The threat-keeping is the part that tends to make people most uncomfortable, because threats fulfilled are, in the world's conventional accounting, evidence of cruelty, while threats not fulfilled are, in the same accounting, evidence of mercy or restraint. Victor's position is that a threat not fulfilled is a lie, and that a lie is a worse act than whatever the threatened consequence amounts to, because a lie corrupts the relationship between what is said and what is real, in a way that no act of force, however severe, corrupts that relationship. This is a position that most people find, on first encounter, either insane or monstrous, and on second encounter, uncomfortably coherent. There is a long list of documented instances in which this code was tested, in which the easier, or the more advantageous, or the more politically acceptable option was the option that involved some form of deception, and in which Victor chose the harder option, because the harder option was the honest one. He has told enemies exactly what he intended to do to them before doing it, not as a form of cruelty or gloating, but as a form of respect, on the grounds that the person being threatened deserves to know the truth of their situation, rather than to operate under false assumptions about it. He has told allies things they did not want to hear, because the truth was more useful to them than comfort would have been. And he has done this with a directness that his allies have often found brutal, and that he has found simply appropriate. He has honored agreements made with entities he despises, including Mephisto, in cases where the honoring of the agreement ran against his immediate interests because the agreement was made and Making agreements is a form of speech, and speech, for Victor, is always accountable to what is real. The specific case of Franklin Richards is the one that tends to produce the strongest reaction in people who are told about it, because it involves Victor doing something that the villain framing provides no adequate account of. Franklin Richards, son of Reed Richards and Sue Storm, has cosmic scale power that has made him, at various points in his history, one of the most significant entities in the universe, and he is also a child. And Victor Von Doom has, on multiple documented occasions, protected him, not as a strategic asset, not as leverage against his father, as a child who was in danger and who Victor, whatever his position relative to Reed Richards, has decided is not something that can be allowed to come to harm when harm is preventable. He has walked away from advantages rather than put Franklin at risk. He has provided protection that cost him significantly, and that he has provided without requiring acknowledgement or compensation. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The most feared man in the Marvel Universe, in Iron in Cold, has a code that produces, when applied with the consistency he applies it, a behavioral record that includes protecting children. He has no strategic reason to protect and keeping promises that are inconvenient to keep and being honest with people when honesty is not the optimal strategic option. This record exists alongside the conquests and the confrontations and the acts that the villain framing requires, and it does not cancel any of those things. What it does is complicate the framing in ways that the framing cannot cleanly absorb. You cannot call someone a villain in the full, uncomplicated sense if they are demonstrably more honest than your heroes. You can call them something, but not that, not cleanly. The heroes lie. Tony Stark has concealed information from his teammates and his government and the people who depended on him for their safety, because concealment served his strategic purposes in ways that disclosure would not have. Reed Richards has made decisions in secret and presented their outcomes as inevitable conclusions rather than choices, because the decision-making process would not have survived exposure to the scrutiny he was trying to avoid. Steve Rogers has, in the timelines where it has become unavoidable, held information back that the people around him needed in order to make genuinely informed choices. These are human beings doing what human beings do, making the decisions available to them with the capabilities available to them, and falling short of their stated values in ways that are understandable and in some cases forgivable. But they are not practicing the code that Victor practices. They are not holding themselves to the standard that Victor holds himself to. And this matters, not because it makes Victor better than them in every dimension, but because it makes him better than them in this one. And this one is not a trivial dimension. The code also governs the specific quality of his anger. Victor is angry in ways that are large and sustained, and that have produced consequences across his history that the scale of the anger alone cannot fully account for. But his anger is never arbitrary. It is never redirected, never displaced, never aimed at a target that is not the actual source of the grievance driving it. When he is furious at Reed Richards, it is because of something Reed Richards did or represents. When he punishes the Baron's successors in Latveria, it is for the specific things that their predecessors did to specific people whose names he knows. The precision of his anger is, in some ways, the most aristocratic thing about him, the thing that most clearly marks him as someone operating by a system, rather than simply giving himself permission to do whatever the anger suggests. What this code costs him is something the story tends not to examine with adequate seriousness, because the cost is invisible in the way that the costs of virtues tend to be invisible compared to the costs of vices. The code costs him flexibility. It costs him the ability to use deception as a tool the way that most of the universe's strategists, heroes and villains alike, use deception as a tool. And deception is an extraordinarily powerful tool that the inability to deploy it constitutes a real and significant limitation. He manages this limitation by being good enough at everything else that the absence of deception from his toolkit does not produce the strategic deficits it would produce for someone less capable. But it is still a limitation, and it is still a cost, and he pays it every time the honest path is the harder path, which is frequently. He pays it because the alternative is not an option. Not in the sense that he has calculated the alternatives and found them less desirable, though he may well have done that calculation, and arrived at that result, in the deeper sense that the version of himself that would use deception is not the version of himself he has been building since the Latverian cold, since his father's coat, since the iron prayer in the monastery. That version does not exist. He constructed himself without it. And the construction is complete, and it is coherent, and it will not be revised for strategic convenience, because revision of that kind would require conceding that the code is conditional. And a conditional code is not a code, it is a preference. And preferences are the province of people who have not yet decided who they are. The night is moving toward its deepest part now. The story is almost done. What remains is the thing underneath all of it, the thing the armor is covering, and the thing the code is protecting, and the thing the rivalry is circling, and the thing that the rose blooms for, down in the dark. For a woman who has been gone since before, the story became the story that the world tells about him. That is where the story ends. That is where it was always going. Come there slowly, in the quiet, in the breath that has grown so soft it barely moves. The contrast with heroes who operate without this constraint becomes most visible in the specific situations where the hero's flexibility produces outcomes that they frame as pragmatic but that, evaluated against Victor's standard, are revealed as concessions to the comfort of operating without accountability to what was actually said. The record of the Marvel Universe's greatest heroes, examined not for their finest moments, but for the consistency of their commitment to the specific content of their stated positions across time and pressure, shows a great deal of movement. Values that were described as absolute are revised when the revision is convenient. Commitments that were made publicly are modified when modification serves the immediate purpose. The framing that makes this movement acceptable in each case is the framing of growth, of adaptation, of the maturity that comes from recognizing that the world is complex. What the framing obscures is that the world was also complex when the original commitment was made, and the complexity of the world is not a retroactive excuse for the failure to hold and to what was said. Victor has held his entire life, from the code that governed his private decisions to the code that governed his public governance, to the code that governed his conduct in the specific and extreme circumstances of cosmic negotiation, to a standard that does not require the world's cooperation to remain valid. The world has not cooperated. The world has produced circumstances in which the code was expensive, in which holding to it cost him things that a more flexible person could have preserved, in which the honesty he was committed to closed doors that lying would have left open. he has paid these costs with the completeness of someone who has decided that the cost is the point, that the virtue is not a virtue if it is practiced only when it is free, that a man is what his code requires him to be not in the easy moments but in the hard one. This standard has made him difficult. It has made him isolated. It has made him, in many respects, genuinely impossible. It has also made him, in the one respect that the code requires, genuinely himself. Let everything be soft now. You have carried this story a long way tonight, across the mountains and the cold and the monastery, and the realm where the light is constructed, and the silence between universes, and the body has been patient with all of it, has allowed the mind its travelling while holding the physical world in its quiet and steady way. Now both can rest. The breath comes in slowly, and it goes slowly, and there is nothing more you need to do tonight. The story has one more thing to say, and it is the simplest thing, and it will say it gently. And when it is done, the night will be there, and the quiet and the deep rest that has been waiting all along for you to arrive. What does Victor von Doom want? This is the question that gets answered most often and most badly in the accounts that exist of him. The question that the villain framing answers with the shortest possible shorthand, which is power, world domination, control, the elimination of threats to his sovereignty. These are not wrong exactly. They are the surface of the answer, the shape the answer makes when seen from a sufficient distance that the texture of it is not visible. What he wants at the level where wanting this specific thing produces the specific life he has lived is something more precise and more human and more difficult to say without seeming to diminish it by the saying. He wants to be right. Not right in the small and daily sense of arguments won in a room, but right in the sense that the architecture of his understanding of the world is correct, that the synthesis he has spent his life building is the correct synthesis, that the governance he has implemented in Latveria is the correct governance, that the calculation he ran in that university laboratory was the correct calculation. He wants the universe to look back at him with the same clarity that he uses to look at the universe, and to see what he sees, which is a man who did the work, who built the thing, who paid the costs and honoured the code and made the descent and pressed the iron to his face and built the world from the pieces of a shattered multiverse with the power of stolen gods, and who was right about all of it, and who deserves, in whatever language the universe uses to confer deserving, the acknowledgement that he was right. The tragedy is that the acknowledgement, when it comes, never quite arrives in a form he can hold. The moment with Reed Richards, when Richards said you would have done it better, was the closest he has come, and it was the closest he will ever come, to the thing he has been building toward. But what Richards said was not, you were right. What Richards said was, I would have done it better, which is a form of acknowledgement that simultaneously contains a form of diminishment, and the simultaneous containing is the specific shape of the tragedy. The way that the thing closest to what you need is never exactly the thing, and the gap between the closest available thing and the actual thing is the gap that Victor von Doom has been living inside for his entire life. Consider what it is like to be the kind of mind that Victor is, in a universe that is full of extraordinary minds, but that does not have, apart from Richards, another mind that operates in the same register. Tony Stark is brilliant in ways that are real and significant, and that have made him, across his history, one of the planet's most important defenders. But Tony Stark, for all his genius, operates primarily in the domain of technology, and his understanding of the non-technological dimensions of reality is, compared to Victor's, shallow. Thor is ancient and powerful, and has seen more of the universe than any human has. But Thor's intelligence is the intelligence of a warrior king, not a scientist sorcerer. Strange is the closest thing the mystical tradition has to appear, and the comparison, as has been noted, is illuminating. But Strange's relationship with technology is rudimentary in ways that Victor's is not. There is no one who can see all of what Victor has built. There is no one who can stand in front of the full structure of his capability and his achievement and see it completely. This is the loneliness at the center of everything. The loneliness that the iron does not prevent, but in some ways produces. Because the iron is the symbol of the choice he made to become something that could not be wounded. And something that cannot be wounded cannot be fully reached. And something that cannot be fully reached cannot be fully known. And something that cannot be fully known cannot be fully witnessed. And full witness is the thing he is building toward, and the thing the iron will always prevent. He solved this problem the way he solves all problems, by refusing to acknowledge that the solving was not complete. The iron stays, the armor stays, the cold stays, the distance stays. And the building continues, because continuing is the only alternative to the admission that would break the structure he has spent his entire life constructing. The mask covers his face. Underneath it, underneath the iron, there is a scar that may or may not be as severe as the world has been told it is. This uncertainty is not incidental. Victor controls the information about his own face with the same care he controls everything else. And the image that the world holds of him, the image of catastrophic disfigurement that the mask was necessary to contain, is an image he has not corrected, not because he is ashamed of the truth, but because the truth is more complicated than the image and the image. In its simplicity, serves purposes that the complicated truth would not serve as well. The mask says, there is something here that cannot be looked at. The mask says, this man is past the ordinary vanities, past the surface, inside something that the surface cannot contain. The mask says, in the language of iron and cold, and the very specific decision to press the burning thing against your own face. I have already survived the worst thing. You cannot reach me with ordinary damage. He goes into Mephisto's realm again next year, and the year after. The rose will bloom in the dark again. The descent will cost him again, in the specific currency of effort and pain, and hope managed carefully enough not to become expectation, because expectation, when repeatedly denied, becomes something that damages the structure of the person doing the expecting. He manages it carefully. He keeps going. He is the kind of person who keeps going, who has always been the kind of person who keeps going, who was that person before there was armor, and before there was a country, and before there was a code. Back when there was only a coat in the cold and the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided the world is going to hear from them, and who has not finished deciding everything else yet. What you are carrying tonight, as the story releases its hold on you, and the mind begins to soften, and the images begin to lose their edges and become something more like weather than like things you can name, is the particular weight of a life that was built from grief, and will not apologize for being built from grief. That is extraordinary in ways that the ordinary vocabulary for extraordinary does not adequately capture, that contains underneath all the drama and the scale, the simplest and most human thing, which is a son who cannot reach his mother and who will not stop trying. That is what Dr. Doom is. underneath the god power and the iron and the code and the rivalry and the rose, a sun, still trying, in the cold, in the dark. Let the story rest now. Let it settle into the soft middle ground that exists between remembering and forgetting, where the shape of things remains after the details have grown quiet. You do not need to hold any of this. You do not need to carry it carefully into the rest of the night. It will be where you left it when you wake. The mind knows how to keep what matters. The body knows how to rest. The breath has become very quiet and very slow. And that is exactly right. The night is very still. You are very still inside it. The thinking is done. The travelling is done. The story has taken you where it needed to take you, and has set you down gently in the dark, in the warm, in the specific peace of a body that has been allowed to stop and a mind that has been allowed to let go. You can be exactly where you are now. That is enough. That is more than enough. Rest. If this story found you somewhere you needed to be found tonight, let it know in the comment below. Leave where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. And if there is a story you have been waiting for someone to tell you slowly, in the dark, at the pace of sleep, leave that there too. The next story is already waiting. It will be here when you return. The question of what Victor Von Doom would do with the acknowledgement he is building toward, if it actually arrived in the form he has been building toward, is one that does not have a clean answer. The honest answer is that it probably would not be enough. The honest answer is that the thing he is reaching for is not really a destination, but a direction. And directions do not conclude. There is always further, always the next demonstration, always the next proof that the synthesis holds. And the governance works, and the code is the correct code, and the calculation was the correct calculation. He would receive the acknowledgement he needed and turn immediately toward the next thing that needed to be proven, because that is what minds of his construction do, and because stopping is not available to him, and because the stopping would require a relationship with completion that he was never built for. Consider what Tony Stark built in a cave with a box of scraps, in circumstances that made building almost impossible. Consider what Steve Rogers chose to be, day after day before and after the serum, in circumstances that made choosing almost optional. These are stories that the world tells, because they illuminate something about what human beings are capable of when the circumstances strip away everything except the essential quality of the person. Victor's story is the same story told from inside a set of circumstances that were worse, by most measures, and that stripped away things that Rogers and Stark were never required to sacrifice. And that produced someone who is harder to admire, because he is harder to see clearly, because the things that make him extraordinary are inseparable from the things that make him terrifying, because the gift and the damage are the same gift and the same damage, woven together so completely that separating them would leave nothing. He is still in the cold. He is always in the cold. The cold of Latveria is where he started, and it is where he returns, in the castle on the ridge, with the iron around him, and the synthesis working in both registers, and the code intact, and the rose made, and the descent pending, and the rivalry ongoing, and the calculation still waiting, after all this time, for the moment when it can finally be resolved. This is what he is. Not the villain, and not the hero, and not the cautionary tale, and not the symbol of anything except possibly the thing that all great and damaged people are symbols of, which is the specific cost of being exactly what you are, fully and without compromise, in a world that has not yet decided whether to be glad you exist. The breath is very soft now, almost entirely soft. The body is resting in the full sense, not the performed sense, not the arranged sense, but the genuine and complete sense of a body that has let the day go and is receiving the night in the way that the night asks to be received, which is without resistance. You have been in the cold and the iron and the dark and the descent and the forge, and the world between universes, and the quiet of a small country in the mountains, where a king makes roses no one sees him make. You can let all of that be where it is now. You can let the images soften, and the names grow quiet, and the story dissolve into the general warmth of wherever you are, in the night, in the rest, in the peace that has been here the whole time, waiting for you to arrive at it